The woods of Staten Island are quiet at night, but not silent. Leaves crunch underfoot. A breeze whispers through the trees, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and decay. If you grew up here, you knew better than to stray too far from the light. Because somewhere out there, or so the story went, Cropsey was waiting. Parents invoked his name as a warning. Don't wander off, or Cropsey will get you. Children dared each other to visit the abandoned buildings where he supposedly lived. Some said he was a deranged escapee from a mental asylum. Others claimed he had a hook for a hand, or that he lurked underground, snatching kids who got too close to his lair. To Staten Island's children of the 1970s and 80s, Cropsey was real enough to keep them awake at night. But as they grew older, most of them came to see him as nothing more than a campfire story. A local bogeyman. Just another urban legend. And then the children really started disappearing. One by one, young kids vanished from quiet streets and playgrounds, leaving families shattered and a community gripped by fear. And when police began to investigate, they discovered something chilling. Some of those whispered stories about Cropsey weren't so far from the truth. Because lurking on the fringes of society was a man whose name would become synonymous with Staten Island's darkest chapter, a man named Andre Rand. This is the story of Cropsey, the line between fact and folklore, and how an urban legend became horrifyingly real. The name Cropsey didn't originate on Staten Island. In fact, variations of the legend can be traced back decades earlier, appearing in campfire stories throughout New York and beyond. As early as the 1940s, counselors at summer camps would tell tales of a disfigured man named Cropsey who haunted the woods nearby. He had supposedly been wronged, burned in a fire, attacked by townsfolk, and now roamed the forest seeking revenge. Sometimes he wielded a bloody axe. Sometimes he dragged a rusty hook where his hand used to be. Like many urban legends, the details changed with every telling, but the message stayed the same. Stay close to camp. Don't wander off alone. The woods aren't safe. When the children of Staten Island heard the name Cropsey in the 1970s, they didn't know they were inheriting a myth. To them, he belonged to their streets, their playgrounds, their abandoned buildings. Some said he lived in the ruins of the Willowbrook State School, the notorious institution for mentally disabled children that stood as a hulking shell after its closure. Others claimed he hid in the tunnels beneath Staten Island, using them to move unseen. Kids dared each other to go Cropsey hunting. Groups of teenagers would sneak into the decaying buildings at Willowbrook with flashlights, taunting each other to explore deeper. The graffiti-covered walls, rusting beds, and echoing corridors added to the sense of dread. Every creak of metal, every gust of wind became proof that Cropsey was near. Local parents encouraged the fear. They used Cropsey to scare their kids into coming home before dark. To them, the story was harmless, just another way to keep children safe. No one really believed that a killer was lurking in the woods. But the myth also reflected something deeper, something unspoken. Staten Island in those days felt forgotten, neglected. The dump that loomed over the island's western edge reeked of decay. The Willowbrook institution, even before it closed, had been exposed for its inhumane conditions. People whispered about unsavory characters living on the fringes, about runaways and ex-patients hiding in the woods. Cropsey became a name for all of it, a single figure to embody the unease everyone felt but couldn't quite name. He was a monster of their own making, born out of fear, neglect, and imagination. But by the 1980s, Staten Island's children would learn just how dangerous it can be to dismiss what hides in the shadows. The Willowbrook State School stood at the center of Staten Island like a scar, sprawling, crumbling, and impossible to ignore. When it opened in 1947, it was billed as a state-of-the-art facility to care for children with intellectual disabilities. But by the 1960s, Willowbrook had become notorious for overcrowding, abuse, and filth. Thousands of children were crammed into spaces designed for hundreds. They were left naked, unattended, lying in their own waste. Diseases ran rampant. Rats crawled through the halls. For decades, the institution was hidden away from public view, out of sight, out of mind. That changed in 1972 when young reporter Geraldo Rivera, tipped off by a whistleblower, snuck into Willowbrook with a camera crew. The footage he captured shocked the nation. Emaciated children rocking back and forth on the floor, sores on their bodies, vacant stares in their eyes. The segment aired on television and sparked outrage, launching investigations and lawsuits. Within a few years, the institution began to shut down, releasing its residents into community care programs. By 1987, Willowbrook was closed for good, but the buildings remained. The sprawling campus quickly became a magnet for vandals, thrill seekers, and the homeless. Tunnels ran beneath the grounds, dark and labyrinthine, perfect for hiding. To Staten Island kids, Willowbrook was the embodiment of fear. They whispered about what might still linger in the shadows. Escaped patients who'd never reintegrated into society, hiding in the ruins and surviving like ghosts. It was here, amid the broken windows and rusting metal of Willowbrook, that the legend of Cropsey found a home. Parents warned their children to stay far away from the buildings. Kids said he lived in the tunnels below, creeping up at night to snatch anyone foolish enough to get too close. But there was more to those stories than most realized. Because while the legend of Cropsey was just a story, Willowbrook's dark legacy was very real, and some of its former residents were indeed released into the community with little to no support. One of them was Andre Rand. Though Rand himself was never officially a patient at Willowbrook, he worked there in the 1960s as a custodian. Later, he was arrested for living in a makeshift campsite near the abandoned buildings. Witnesses reported seeing him frequent the tunnels, scavenging for food and supplies. He was often dirty, disheveled, and seemingly unstable, exactly the kind of figure the Cropsey legend conjured in the minds of children. And as the years passed, whispers grew louder. Whenever a child went missing on Staten Island, people began to wonder, was it just bad luck? Or was Cropsey real after all? In the summer of 1987, those questions became impossible to ignore, because that was the year a 12-year-old girl named Jennifer Schweiger went missing. And the search for her would lead straight to the gates of Willowbrook. Andre Rand was born Frank Russian in 1944 in New York City. His early years remain largely undocumented, but what is known paints a troubling portrait. His father died when Rand was still young, and his mother was later institutionalized at Pilgrim Psychiatric Center on Long Island. By his own account, Rand spent much of his childhood visiting her there, an experience that may have left scars he never revealed. In the 1960s, Rand began working at the Willowbrook State School as a custodian and orderly. Coworkers would later describe him as odd, but unremarkable, a quiet man who kept to himself. But in 1969, Rand was arrested for allegedly attempting to sexually assault a 9-year-old girl after luring her into his car. He served time for the offense and, upon release, drifted through low-paying jobs and transient living situations. By the late 1970s, he was reportedly homeless, camping out in the woods and, at times, in the tunnels beneath Willowbrook. Over the years, Rand was arrested several more times for burglary, public indecency, and unlawful imprisonment. Each charge seemed minor on its own, but they painted a picture of a man sliding further into instability. Despite his record, Rand remained largely invisible. Staten Island in the 1980s was a place where people like him, poor, mentally ill, unwanted, could vanish into the margins. But his name kept surfacing. Witnesses claimed to see him wandering near schools and playgrounds, watching children from a distance. Parents began to mutter his name alongside Cropsey's, as if the two figures had merged. By the time children began to disappear, the community's fear had a face. Andre Rand became the human embodiment of the Cropsey legend, lurking where he didn't belong, always watching, always waiting. When 12-year-old Jennifer Schweiger vanished in 1987, police turned their eyes to Rand. And for the first time, they began to wonder whether the stories kids told about Cropsey hiding in the ruins of Willowbrook were closer to reality than they'd imagined. Jennifer Schweiger was not the first child to disappear on Staten Island, but she was the first whose case would break the community's silence. On July 9, 1987, Jennifer, a 12-year-old girl with Down syndrome, left her family's home for a walk and never returned. Her disappearance ignited panic. Hundreds of volunteers combed the island, searching abandoned lots, wooded trails, and the haunting remains of Willowbrook. For weeks, search parties scoured every corner of Staten Island, calling her name. But Jennifer's case was just the latest in a disturbing pattern. In 1972, 5-year-old Alice Pereira vanished after playing outside her apartment complex. She had been riding her tricycle with her brother and cousins. When they went inside for a moment, she was gone. Witnesses later claimed to have seen Andre Rand in the area that day. In 1981, 7-year-old Holly and Hughes disappeared while walking to a store near her home. Her parents filed a missing persons report, but she was never found. Several witnesses later testified that they saw her arguing with a man matching Rand's description near a Volkswagen. At the time, police lacked enough evidence to make an arrest. In 1983, 11-year-old Tyahese Jackson disappeared after leaving her foster home in New Brighton. Like the others, she was never seen again. That same year, 22-year-old Hank Gafforio, a young man with developmental disabilities, went missing after telling his family he was going to meet someone. He too was never found. Each of these cases shared unsettling similarities. Young, vulnerable victims, many with intellectual disabilities, and all vanished without a trace. For years, these disappearances haunted Staten Island. Rumors swirled. Parents grew more protective. And as whispers of Cropsey spread among children, adults began quietly connecting the dots, wondering if their urban legend was no legend at all. When Jennifer Schweiger went missing, volunteers immediately focused their search near Willowbrook. Many of them already suspected that whoever had taken her was hiding in the tunnels beneath the abandoned buildings. Over and over, they descended into the dark, claustrophobic passageways, finding nothing but old furniture, rotting mattresses, and the stench of mildew. But the searchers refused to give up. On August 9th, exactly 1 month after she vanished, a volunteer named Bill Flynn was walking along a wooded path near Willowbrook when he noticed something half buried in the dirt. He stopped and looked closer, and then he saw her. Jennifer's body was lying in a shallow grave, just yards from the ruins of the institution. The discovery shattered the community. The fear and anger that had been simmering for years boiled over, and suspicion quickly turned to Andre Rand. Witnesses reported seeing him near Jennifer's neighborhood the day she disappeared. Others said they'd seen him lurking near Willowbrook during the search. To many on Staten Island, it seemed obvious the bogeyman of their childhoods had finally been unmasked. Police arrested Rand on suspicion of kidnapping and murder. But building a solid case against him would prove more difficult than anyone expected. In the days and weeks after Jennifer Schweiger went missing, Staten Island came together in a way it never had before. Dozens of volunteers fanned out every morning, meeting in parking lots and church basements to organize their search. They combed the island's overgrown paths and vacant lots. They poked through the forgotten corners of Willowbrook, climbing over rusted fences and into darkened tunnels. They brought flashlights, ropes, and shovels. Many of them brought nothing but determination. The search was grueling. The July heat was relentless, and the woods were full of hazards, broken glass, rats, collapsing ceilings in the buildings. But the volunteers refused to stop. They marked off grids on maps and methodically searched every section of the island, convinced that somewhere Jennifer was waiting to be found. The ruins of Willowbrook loomed over the effort, both physically and symbolically. Searchers reported finding makeshift campsites deep in the woods, with blankets, empty cans, and scattered belongings. They were sure that someone, maybe Rand, maybe others, was still living there. Every creak of metal, every distant footstep sent shivers through the search parties. Days turned into weeks with no sign of Jennifer. The mood began to shift from hopeful to grim. Yet still they searched. On August 9th, volunteer Bill Flynn noticed something odd along a wooded trail, a patch of disturbed soil near the Willowbrook grounds. He called over others and began to dig. A few inches down, the outline of a small body emerged. It was Jennifer. Her body showed signs of strangulation. Investigators soon confirmed that she had been killed shortly after her disappearance. The discovery was heartbreaking, but gave the community a sense of closure and resolve. They would not allow her death to go unanswered. Witnesses had placed Andre Rand near Jennifer's neighborhood the day she vanished. One man claimed Rand had been seen leading her by the hand toward the woods. Police tracked him down and brought him in for questioning. At his campsite near Willowbrook, they found ropes, clothing, and other items they believed tied him to the crime. Rand denied everything, insisting he had nothing to do with her death. But to many on Staten Island, the evidence was clear enough. Their fear of Cropsey had finally materialized in flesh and blood. On August 13th, 1987, Andre Rand was officially charged with kidnapping and murder. The trial would become one of Staten Island's most closely watched events and raise unsettling questions about how much of the legend was myth and how much was real. The arrest of Andre Rand in August 1987 marked a turning point, both for Staten Island's law enforcement and its frightened residents. But despite the public's certainty about his guilt, the prosecution faced a major challenge. Hard evidence was scarce. Jennifer Schweiger's body had been found near Willowbrook, a location Rand was known to frequent. Multiple witnesses placed him near her neighborhood the day she disappeared. Some claimed he was seen leading her by the hand, but there were no fingerprints, no eyewitness to the crime itself, no DNA, only a pattern and a name that sent chills through the community. The trial began in 1988. Prosecutors charged Rand with kidnapping and second-degree murder. But from the outset, the case proved difficult. The jury could not reach a consensus on the murder charge. The evidence simply wasn't conclusive enough. They did, however, convict him of first-degree kidnapping. Rand was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. For many on Staten Island, the verdict was bittersweet. Rand was behind bars, but the unanswered questions remained. What had really happened to Jennifer? And what about the other children? In 2004, more than 15 years after his first conviction, Rand was brought to trial again, this time for the 1981 disappearance of Holly and Hughes. This case also relied heavily on circumstantial evidence, witness testimony, patterns of behavior, and the claim that Rand had been seen with Hughes shortly before she vanished. Despite the lack of a body or forensic evidence, the jury found Rand guilty of kidnapping. He received another 25 years to life sentence to be served consecutively. It ensured he would likely spend the rest of his life in prison. Rand maintained his innocence through both trials. He never confessed, never offered an explanation. To some, this silence was a final, cruel confirmation of guilt. To others, it left space for doubt. Without bodies or physical proof in most of the disappearances, the question lingered. Was Andre Rand truly responsible for all the missing children? Or had he become a convenient scapegoat for a community desperate for answers? In 2009, filmmakers Joshua Zaman and Barbara Brancaccio released a documentary simply titled Cropsey. For both directors, the story was personal. They had grown up on Staten Island, trading the Cropsey legend like ghost stories at sleepovers. But as adults, they began to wonder how much of that legend was rooted in truth. The film begins with the myth, the hook-handed killer, the warnings from parents, the trips to Willowbrook, but quickly veers into darker territory. The real-life cases of missing children and the man named Andre Rand who became the face of the myth. What starts as a nostalgic look at urban folklore becomes an unsettling exploration of fear, memory, and justice. Zaman and Brancaccio gained access to court records, police interviews, and even corresponded with Rand himself, though he ultimately declined to speak on camera. The film includes chilling archival footage, including the infamous Geraldo expose of Willowbrook and interviews with those who searched for the missing children. Cropsey doesn't argue that Rand is innocent, but it does question how folklore shapes perception. how a community's collective fear can amplify the image of a man until he becomes a monster. The documentary blurs the lines between myth and reality, leaving viewers to decide for themselves. Was Rand a cunning predator or a scapegoat shaped by decades of fear? Critics praised the film for its nuanced approach. It wasn't a true crime spectacle. It was a meditation on the nature of belief and how the stories we tell can become more real than the facts they're built upon. For many viewers, especially those unfamiliar with Staten Island's history, Cropsey was a revelation. It showed how myths don't just entertain, they can warn, haunt, and in some cases condemn. Urban legends don't arise in a vacuum. They are shaped by their environment, the fears of a community, the shadows in its history, the secrets it tries to forget. In Staten Island, those shadows were long and deep. The Cropsey myth grew not just because of Willowbrook or Andre Rand, but because the island itself had been isolated and overlooked for decades. Landfills dotted the horizon. Mental institutions were tucked away in remote corners. Even the island's geography, with its wooded lots and hidden pathways, seemed made for hiding things. When children began disappearing, the community turned inward. Rumors spread faster than facts. The media coverage, though often factual, was tinged with sensationalism. News anchors leaned into the horror, evoking the image of a lurking predator, always just out of sight. Rand, with his wild-eyed stare and unsettling past, fit the role too well. The line between man and myth began to dissolve. Some residents began to see Rand not as a person, but as a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. The failings of the state system, the abandonment of Willowbrook's residents, the fear that no one was truly safe, even in their own neighborhoods. This transformation wasn't unique to Staten Island. Across America, communities have created their own versions of Cropsey. The Mothman in West Virginia, the Slender Man of internet folklore, the Jersey Devil in the Pine Barrens. These stories serve a purpose. They externalize danger. They give a name and face to the unexplainable. But in Staten Island, the consequences were real. A man went to prison for the rest of his life. Not for the myth, but for crimes that may or may not be fully proven. A generation grew up afraid, not just of the dark, but of what they were told lived inside it. And yet, even now, many who lived through those years still hesitate when asked, was Cropsey real? The truth is complex. Andre Rand was a real person, with a criminal record and a troubling presence. But the version of him that haunted sleepovers and schoolyards, the monster with the hook, the kidnapper in the tunnels, that was something else. That was the shape fear took when reality became too hard to face. The story of Cropsey, like most legends, resists a neat ending. Even today, decades later, it remains difficult to untangle what is fact, what is fiction, and what lies in between. We know Andre Rand was real. We know he worked at Willowbrook, lived in the woods nearby, and was convicted twice of kidnapping. First for Jennifer Schweiger, then for Holly and Hughes. We know that witnesses claimed to see him with his victims. And we know his presence terrified a community already on edge. We also know that evidence tying him directly to any murder was circumstantial. Jennifer Schweiger's body was found, but no forensic proof connected Rand to her death. Holly and Hughes was never found, and neither were Alice Pereira, Tyhees Jackson, or Hank Gafforio. Their disappearances remain officially unsolved. What remains is a troubling set of facts. A man with a history of predatory behavior. A string of vanished children. A community eager, perhaps desperate, to believe that the bogeyman in their stories was finally caught. But even if Andre Rand was guilty of everything he was accused of, he wasn't the Cropsey of legend. He didn't have a hook for a hand. He didn't stalk the night in a bloody mask or live entirely underground. He was something more ordinary and perhaps more frightening. A broken man shaped by neglect, hiding in plain sight. The legend of Cropsey, meanwhile, has endured. It's told today much as it was in the 1970s, passed from one generation of Staten Island children to the next. Parents still invoke his name when warning their kids not to wander off. Teenagers still dare each other to enter the tunnels of Willowbrook after dark, hoping to glimpse something lurking in the shadows. Some see this as harmless, a way for the island to process its past, to keep the memory of its dark chapter alive. Others argue that the myth obscures the real lessons of the story, how institutions failed their most vulnerable residents, how families of the missing were left without answers, how easy it is for fear to fill in the blanks left by a lack of justice. And perhaps that's the final truth about Cropsey. He is not just a man, not just a myth. He is what happens when a community's fears and failures are allowed to fester in the dark. He is a reminder that the scariest stories are often the ones we tell ourselves, and the most terrifying monsters are the ones we allow to take root in reality. In the quiet woods of Staten Island, the ruins of Willowbrook still stand. The walls are crumbling. The tunnels are flooded and choked with debris. But the place still draws visitors, ghost hunters, thrill seekers, former residents returning to face old memories. They walk the same paths where Jennifer Schweiger's body was found. They shine their flashlights into the darkness, half hoping and half afraid to see something staring back. They call out his name, Cropsey, daring him to answer. But nothing answers. That silence is perhaps the most haunting part of the story. For all the fear, all the accusations, all the years that have passed, the truth has never spoken clearly. The missing children remain missing. Andre Rand sits in prison, unrepentant and unreadable. And the community continues to live with its questions. Was Cropsey real? In one sense, no. He was never the monstrous figure of campfire lore, never the hook-handed killer that children whispered about in the dark. But in another sense, he was real all along, a symbol of forgotten places and forgotten people, a warning that the real world holds more danger than any ghost story. Urban legends thrive because they make sense of chaos. They give shape to fear. And for Staten Island, the legend of Cropsey became a way to explain what no one wanted to face. That children can disappear, that institutions can fail, that danger can come from the places and people we choose not to see. Even now, the story endures because it asks a question no one can fully answer. How much of what we fear is imagined, and how much is waiting just beyond the light? So the next time you hear a story about a monster in the woods, ask yourself, is it just a story? Or is it something we've chosen not to see? What do you think of today's story? What dark chapter should we open next? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like and subscribe. Close the book if you can. This is Black Chapter.